Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, 7 Best Practices for Active Shooter Preparedness, presented by Security Management Magazine and sponsored by Everbridge. Everbridge is a global enterprise software company that provides applications which automate the delivery of critical information to help keep people safe and businesses running. My name is Mike Moran. I am the Strategic Publishing Director with ASIS International, and I will be your moderator today. Today's presentation will be an hour, including time reserved at the close for questions and answers. I encourage you to submit a question at any time in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. If you hold an ASIS International certification, your attendance today is approved for 1 hour of continuing education toward that recertification. Credit will be applied automatically based on your attendance record for this event. Typical processing will take as much as 2 months. So if you have an immediate need for those credits, please contact the ASIS certification directly or reach out to me. I would like to take just a moment to note that the response to this event has been overwhelming. We have more than 1,900 people registered for today's event. We are not going to get to every question asked today, but I don't want that to dissuade you from asking. In some cases, we will address multiple questions on the same subject, and the more people who ask that question, the more likely it will be addressed. We will also try to follow up questions that we aren't able to address during the event. Tomorrow, you will get a link to the archived event. You can view this again. As well, you can download the presentation. You can share this with colleagues, and we'd ask you to take a brief survey. There'll be a link in that email tomorrow. I would also like to direct your attention to the resources panel at the bottom of your screen. There's a lot of great content in there for you to review on this subject. So without further ado, let me introduce Regina Phelps. Regina Phelps. We were very fortunate to have Regina with us today. She's an internationally recognized expert in the field of emergency management and continuity planning. Ms. Phelps conducts more than 100 exercises per year for large multinational organizations. She has lectured extensively at international disaster and business continuity conferences. She's also the founder of Emergency Management and Safety Solutions, a consulting company specializing in emergency management, continuity planning, and safety. So let me go ahead and get out of the way for the person you came to hear today. Regina?
Thanks, Mike, for that very kind introduction. First of all, it's a real pleasure for me to be with you today to talk about the 7 best practices of an active shooter program. This situation of workplace violence, and in particular the active shooter scenario, seems as if it has evolved to be one of the regular occurrences in the American landscape. We were reminded of that again just this week with the events that occurred on the Ohio State University campus. Not an active shooter, but a case of violence. Now, I come to this topic, as you might notice from my introduction, not as a security professional, but I come from the perspective of a crisis manager, which I've been in practice for 34 years. Our approach to this topic is inclusive, and by that I mean we look at this from a perspective of emergency response, business continuity, crisis communications, and crisis management. This scenario has something for everyone, and everybody has skin in the game. Now, today I'm going to throw a wide net when I talk about this idea of best practices. And by that I mean I want to discuss what a successful workplace violence and active shooter program is when you combine them. Let me explain my rationale for this approach, as an active shooter usually falls into one of these 3 categories. It might be somebody that you don't know, so somebody that has never made themselves known to you, and in other words, they have no prior experience with your organization, but they have came to your location to create havoc. Secondly, it could be somebody that you do know. It could be a student, for example, if you're in a school setting. It could be an employee, a contractor. It could be a patient or a patient's family if you're in a healthcare situation. It could be a disgruntled employee, a disgruntled customer. It could be somebody that you've had experience with and you possibly have seen signs and symptoms. And perhaps you'd even let their intentions be known through threats. The third possibility is it could be somebody that your company knows somewhat secondhand. And by that I mean it could be a spouse of an employee or a relative, a boyfriend, of some relationship of somebody within your organization. So when you look at those three types of possible scenarios, two of them are ones that a workplace violence program could potentially engage with prior to any act of violence. So for us, when we look at this as the potential for some intervention. So when I talk about it, I like to talk about it literally from that perspective, which is the idea that we have active shooters and workplace violence. Because in our mind, in our consulting practice, as my slide talks about, is that they go hand in hand. And so we might have been able to do something. And so that's why when I present my points today, you'll actually see that they are really looking at both. Now, my introduction to workplace violence and active shooters came a very long time ago. There was a very famous incident in my town where I work and live, which is San Francisco, California, and it was known as 101 California. Interestingly enough, that's just the location of the event. That's not the business that this act of violence was created against. It happened to be one of our clients, a large law firm known as Pettit & Martin. And on July 1st, 1993, that is a long time ago, a man by the name of Gianfrani entered their offices of Pettit & Martin on the 34th floor, and back then there was very little, if any, security in the building. Remember, we're talking 1993. He was carrying a large bag, and he had two handguns in them, and he essentially began to shoot that floor out. He walked into a conference room that was filled with individuals who were doing a deposition, and he basically shot everyone there. He then wandered down the hallway, he got into the stairwell, and he exited the next floor down using the internal stairwell and got off on 33. He shot several more people on 33, and at the end of that experience, 8 people were killed, 6 others were injured. Now, interestingly enough, he then committed suicide very shortly after in the stairwell as the San Francisco police closed in on him. We've talked about this particular case in our firm since 1993, and one of the reasons we have, not only from the act of violence, from the emergency response, but 2 other major issues. One was from a crisis management perspective, and the second was business continuity. This firm, the 3rd largest law firm in the state of California, went out of business 2 years later. They dissolved, even after they did all the right things, the counseling, the remodeling, the reaching out, all of those activities that are encouraged to do after any act of violence. But they could not survive this particular act, and they went out of business 2 years later. So from our perspective, that's when we realized a long time ago that an active shooter or a case of workplace violence is a crisis management problem, an emergency response problem, a business continuity problem, a crisis communications problem, and a crisis management problem. So let me first of all talk about a survey that Everbridge and I did this last year. And what it did show was, as we all know, as active shooter incidents that are on the rise. And we certainly referenced the recent FBI information that talked about that very clearly. And in that survey, it actually, on the FBI side, showed that our increase of violence has increased significantly from 6.4 incidents per year to 16.4. Now, what's interesting, though, is that many people are very concerned about this active shooter issue. So in our survey, we asked them, well, gosh, if you're so concerned about this, what the heck are you doing? And what I'd like to do is we'd like to actually ask some questions in our audience today. And Michael, are you going to run these polls for us?
Absolutely. So our first question, my company has a well-developed workplace violence active shooter policy and program. Would you strongly agree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree with this proposal? Go ahead and take a moment and select an answer, and we'll just give it a few moments here. Okay, that's
yes, we were curious.
Let's go ahead.
Oh, good. Very good.
So,
no, that's
what
quite
we
all
see
right.
here, my company is a well-developed workplace violence. 14% strongly agree, 15%. 31% disagree, 42% agree, and 11% strongly agree. What do you think about those numbers?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So we've got 45% of the audience, essentially, that are saying that either they strongly disagree or disagree that their program at their company is an effective, well-developed program. So that's close to 50%. That's a little bit better, actually. And actually, I'm not surprised by that, because if you look at our audience, which is comprised of many security professionals, I would think that you would have a better program than most. What we discovered in our survey is that 69% of the organizations that were viewing this issue of active shooter were concerned about it, and 79% of them said that their organizations were not fully prepared. And notice the key word, not fully prepared. So it was a significant issue. So our audience is better off than our survey, which again, with a lot of security professionals, I'm not surprised. What this survey told us was that this is a big concern, that a lot of people are not aggressively working on workplace violence and active shooter related concerns. So let me talk about the 7 best practices now that we have a sense of what you're all doing, and we're going to peel this back and we're going to look at each one of them in turn. The first one I'd like to talk about is really a developed workplace violence policy and program. The first workplace violence policy and program that we developed for our company was in the mid-90s. We've done many since that time, but I will tell you that this is one of the most important things I do not see in most organizations. And as I take through this, I'll point out the things in particular that I don't see companies embracing. So let's first of all talk about the policy part of this first point. The policy should have a variety of key components in it. It should be very well crafted. It should have a clear goal and objective for this policy, and overwhelmingly you're going to see something about the reduction or the reduction of violence and threats in an organization. You have to have clear definitions, because what might be a verbal threat to you might be a different definition to somebody else. So when you talk about threats, you have to be very clear about what you're talking about. Is this only physical acts of violence? Does it have to include weapons? Is it a threat? Is it harassment? Is it bullying? Those are all the kinds of things you need to discuss in the policy. You need to talk about the scope. Is it just your company headquarters? Is it the entire organization? Does it include the field staff, individuals who might be working out of their home? Be very clear. The second thing the policy has to clearly talk about is prohibited behaviors. So, and that gets back to, again, not just the obvious ones, use of weapons, use of physical force, but do you also include bullying? Do you also include threats, harassment? That all should be clearly defined in that prohibited content. Or conduct, excuse me. Then you want to talk about whether you would actually obtain or suggest that you would have a restraining order or the use of those devices. There are pluses and minuses about those, and we'll talk about that in a bit. How you report a safety concern, because your employees definitely want to know that. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then how things are investigated and how they're enforced. So that's the bare minimum of a policy. So just to go back to the definition, it's something to consider. For the purposes of this policy, workplace violence is defined as a single behavior, a series of behaviors which constitute actual or potential assault, battery, harassment, intimidation, threats, or similar actions, attempted destruction, or threats to the company or personnel property. And then you might say, again, as far as the scope, which occur in a company workplace, while using company resources, a company work location, or while an individual is engaged in company business. So it may sound to be parsing words, but you've got to be very clear about what the definition is. So when you come up with that clear, well-crafted policy, then what you're going to have to do, of course, is vet that with lots of people. Senior management, human resources, legal are very likely. Others might be regulatory compliance-related organizations, because some businesses may need to have this to comply with regulatory needs and or something that your large customers or clients might require. Be very careful with the terms such as zero tolerance. I used to see this a lot in the 90s and in the early 2000s. I see it less now, but occasionally it peaks up. What does zero tolerance mean? Well, if you say very clearly in your policy, we have a zero tolerance for any workplace violence threats, and you go through and define them, that means jokes. That means offhanded comments in elevators. Technically, with a zero tolerance means that that policy is then evoked. So if you can't maintain that, if you can't manage that, if it's not that kind of a policing action that you want to do, you have to be very careful about that term. You also want to make sure that you call out prohibited behaviors. Not long ago, bullying was not a topic that you saw when you looked at a workplace violence program, but increasingly, bullying has become an important issue. And we have seen that increasingly added to workplace violence policies. You also want to clearly talk about the sanctions or the actions that you will take from a disciplinary perspective. Does that include termination? Does that include relief without pay? How many days? How many occurrences? And again, being pretty explicit so that people are clearly understanding what that is. Then what you need to do, of course, is post this. And normally it should be posted where all of your usual OSHA postings are. But posting it is not enough. You have to educate your staff about this policy, and I'll talk more about that under the best practice number 5, but it's critically important, and that's where I find most organizations fail to actually fully implement their policy. You also want to make sure that you really talk carefully in the policy and in the program, which I'll talk about in a second, about how to report an incident. Because many times employees might indeed either be threatened by someone or hear an employee threaten another one. They don't know exactly how to report it. Who do I tell? Do I call HR? Do I tell my manager? How do I go about that? Do I call security? And then the next thing they want to know is if I report it, what are you going to do? Because people are fearful of actually doing a complaint, notifying a manager, and then all of a sudden being called out by saying, oh yes, John just informed us that you made a threat. And then people don't want to say that. So that's an important issue as well. So you want to make sure that you clearly talk about how you're going to investigate it. And then what all the follow-up is. Because people, again, they'll do the right thing if indeed they understand what you're going to do. Now there's many sources. There are many sources on workplace violence policies, but there are two that are very broad that I thought you might want to look at. One of them is from the Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence, and as you can tell from the title, its thrust is really domestic violence, but they have very good documentation on workplace violence policies. And the second is the Society for HR Resource Management, and they have a very good draft policy and a draft program that I would suggest that you take a look at if you either want to check yours out to make sure that it's the most current, and or you're starting from scratch and you want to see how to go about developing a policy. Then you want to look at the overall components of a workplace violence program. So the policy is only one little piece. But then what's the program? And the way I would ask you to think about a workplace violence program, think of it like a security program. Think of it like a safety program. It has a variety of component pieces to it. And this is, again, the most common failure I see in most companies. They might have a policy, but they don't have a program that really embraces it and really pushes it into the population. So again, parts of this will come from your policy, but you need to have clear definitions. You need to say who's responsible. So is this a program that's driven by the HR department? Is it driven by security? Or maybe it's driven by both of them in combination. Or maybe it's driven by legal. Or maybe a particular business unit. I've seen it also done by facilities. So who's responsible? What are their tasks? And be clear and explicit in the program so that people understand, just like in a safety program, how it works. The issues of compliance, we talked about that a little bit with the policy. And then a very clear documentation of how you report an incident and how you go about investigating things. So looking at the hazard assessment is also a key issue of a workplace violence program, and that's very commonly done in security anyway, looking at security exposures that you might have that might create an environment or a possibility for somebody to be able to enter your workplace. How you investigate and how you correct problems that you find. And then how you do training and how you do instruction. And then again, the issues of reporting and how you do record keeping. Those are all the key components you would find for any basic security program, emergency response, security. But this is about workplace violence. So what you're looking for is a comprehensive approach that deals with how to manage an event. Now, a couple of other things about the program. We talked about detailing procedures to make sure that people are clear about how threats are handled. I can't really emphasize that enough. One thing I didn't say at the beginning of my introduction is that in our 34 years of practice, we've had 47 murders at our client population. These have been primarily white-collar, high-rise environments. About 65% of them have been either from a coworker, an employee, a contractor, a vendor. And that also includes domestic violence. So a small percentage have been the person who comes onto the scene with no relationship with you. But in our experience, most of them have been people that we know about and possibly either weren't managed well or were managed, but they still acted out. So again, the reporting is a critical issue from our perspective. The thing that's always important to consider in the workplace violence program is some discussion about restraining orders. Now, you might think, when you think about a restraining order, well, of course we're going to get one. Well, you know, I would just say to you that in the psychologists that we've talked to about restraining orders in particular, it's not so clear-cut. There have been several cases, and in fact, one of ours, which was a case in Sunnyvale with a company called ESL, who had a case of workplace violence, and the person who came to commit the act of violence was an employee that came to the business on the day his restraining order was served to him. So it's not always a clear-cut case. So it's good to work with psychologists, behavioral individuals who can help you assess the individual as to whether that's an appropriate act. So I don't think it's a clear-cut yes or no, but it requires some thought as you go about your decision making. You should also very clearly in your workplace violence program talk about what your employee assistance program can do for you. The vast majority of American companies now have some form of an employee assistance program, which is a huge resource. They're going to be able to provide for you employee counseling, family counseling, and outreach for a protracted period of time to help your employees get over this incident. But know what they can do and know how you can get a hold of them and know how they can ramp up immediately. Can they do phone consultations? Do people have to go see them in person? Can they do groups? Those are all things you should know right now. Not just for workplace violence, but other kinds of issues that could occur where you might need that kind of support. And the last key thing that I would like to see in your workplace violence program is some aspect of communication, because communications is key on so many levels. And what I want to talk about immediately is how you would manage your emergency communications. Do you have an emergency notification system, an ENS? If you have an ENS, do you have pre-programmed templates? Do you have appropriate divisions and groups that you could immediately deploy? And I'll talk more about this in a bit. But if you have an emergency notification system, it gives you another really important vehicle to touch people quickly. It's also important that your communications team has pre-written templates and communications that would be available immediately for both press releases, social media, Twitter in particular, 140-character tweets about a violent situation that might have occurred at your facility, as well as talking points for employees. That can be done right now. And then all you do is you go back at the time of the situation, and then what you do is that you just modify it on the fly. It's so much more effective to do that in advance rather than at the moment. Also, who would be the appropriate spokesperson? And I will tell you, in the 47 murders that we've had, it's rarely been the corporate spokesperson, the communications person who's the main spokesperson for an event like this in the first few days. It's usually the CEO. And the reason for that is that in a case of violence, you want the most senior person who runs that company to step forward and express their concern and angst and all of those appropriate things that you want. But that should be predetermined in advance, and ideally that person has some very good media training. The last thing I do want to mention is if you happen to be in the state of California or you're looking at the state of California for business, Cal OSHA, which is one of the state-sponsored OSHA programs, is now coming out with new standards for healthcare in relationship to workplace violence. Now, the state of California has been very progressive about workplace violence programs, but it has not been a requirement with OSHA here in the state of California. They have had guidelines, actually since the early 90s. Now, those guidelines now have been retweaked, if you will, and now they are going forward with regulations for healthcare. So that's emergency departments, clinics. It had a really huge net when they first launched it, but they have tapered it down a bit. So, but still, it's going to be in effect sometime at the beginning part of this year. So if you're in healthcare, or you're a security person and you're curious about this, you should definitely Google Cal OSHA Title 8, Section 3342, which is under healthcare facilities, and you want to look at what their requirements are going to be for this new standard, which is still not finalized, but close to it. Number two, a critically important one of your program is actually having a violent threat assessment team. So let's peel that back for a moment. Who should be on this team? Well, you know, it's kind of a likely cast of characters, as you might imagine. HR, of course, security, safety, facilities, legal. You might have workers' comp or some insurance representative. People will often have trainers in there as well. There might be employee assistance programs. There might be some administration or management. It's usually a group of individuals, maybe 5 or 6. Almost always HR, security, safety, facilities, legal, and then somebody from the administration or management. Now, these folks have a particularly important role. In your documentation that would be in your program, you'd want to say very clearly how this team is activated. And most commonly when we write these, we actually have it by levels. And maybe you can imagine a level of 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 might be the team is simply notified that there's something happening. Maybe there's a slight threat that's been trickling up from security or from HR, and it's more of a heads up, and maybe some people are beginning to do a little bit of diligence, but the team is not necessarily evoked to come together to make an assessment. A level 2 might be where the situations become more serious and the threats are more pronounced, and the team does actually meet and convene, begin its work. Level 3 might be an actual incident itself. It's very clear that you need to have an activation process, how this team meets, how they work. So are they should all know that they're on call 24 hours a day. They should be all carrying the appropriate electronic equipment at all times to be able to be notified. They should have an emergency notification system, ideally where one person can do an outreach and they can immediately all jump on a bridge to talk about something. But all of that activation process is important. That should not be decided on the fly. It should be very systematic. And then you also, if you do already have a regular incident assessment team, when we set up crisis management teams all over the world, we always have an initial assessment team as part of that. It's not a threat assessment team, which is very, very specific and different. But if you have a assessment team, you want to figure out how those two teams can work. Now, in this documentation for the threat assessment team, you want to have very clear roles and responsibilities. So I would love to see, if I was auditing your materials, I'd love to see the kind of the title of each department and what their role and responsibility was on this team. So if it's security, in particular, I'd want to know what their role is, what their responsibility is, and I would want to see that in probably 5 to 10 bullets. So again, that's good for training them, but also so they know what their job is. And it's also clear to say who does what. You know, who's in charge of this team? You need a chair or somebody to run it. And again, you want to make sure you have very clear documentation about how it's activated. This team also needs to be really educated about workplace violence and active shooter situations. So how are you going to do that? Are you going to do training? Are you going to utilize materials, for example, from the Department of Homeland Security? Are you going to bring in key security professionals or your local police department? You just really understand violence. And you also want them to know about the problem already in your company. Now, a lot of people will say, well, gosh, we've never had any threats, blah, blah, blah. And I always sort of shake my head and I look at them and say, go check your HR department. Because they're going to know about every restraining order that somebody's got, that an employee's got against a domestic violence situation. They'll know about people who have made threats to others. They know what's going on. And you can bet in most companies there are already issues percolating somewhere. And your HR department is usually the one that's going to know what those are. And And then the other thing that you want to make sure is that you have some outside professionals that you can call in for assistance. And who might those be? You might have a security professional, whether that's executive protection or the ability to do security assessments or the ability to be able to assess an individual and their possible threat profile. Psychologists as well as behavioral specialists, because they might again assess the individual to determine what their likely threat and ability is. And so that's another good resource you want to have, and they can certainly come in as well to do training with this particular team. Now this threat assessment team's got essentially 5 different functions once they're actually activated. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to obviously gather information. You know, what does the team know about the individual, the possible perpetrator, or about the targets of this individual's rage? And so they first of all is information gathering. Who does that on the team? How do they do it? It's very likely the security folks and the HR folks that would be doing that, but that should be clearly stated. The second thing they're going to be doing is they might be interviewing either the person who's making the threats or the perpetrator or potentially some of the victims. But again, finding out more detail by interviewing these individuals and finding out exactly what's going on. And then, of course, now that they've actually gathered the information, they've actually interviewed the folks, they have to evaluate what this means. What does it mean as terms as threats or violence to the organization or to the people? And now once they've evaluated that, they're going to have to make a decision. What do we do? How do we deal with this right now? How do we deal with this situation in the future? Who's going to take the lead role in managing this person, the behavior, the actions, the discipline, whatever it is? So there's some key decisions that need to be made. And then, of course, with any good program, you have to do follow-up, continual follow-up. What you want to do is some sort of emotional temperature checking, because you want to make sure that situations may have cooled possibly, but there could be some percolation. And I'll give you an example of this. We had a case of workplace violence in one of our clients where the person who came back to commit the murder was actually terminated 1 year ago to the day and came back and killed 3 people on the day of their termination. So sometimes these have a long shelf life. The third suggestion we have is that you should be reaching out to your local law enforcement now. Not when an incident happens, but now. They're a huge resource to you. So you want to meet them now in advance and begin a relationship. So invite them to your organization. Invite them to one of your threat assessment team meetings. Share their policy. Share your program, all of your emergency procedures. Share your floor plans. And if you have a large organization in particular, like a warehouse, a maintenance facility, with lots of nooks and crannies, it's a great suggestion to do a walkthrough and see what's going on. And they can give you some suggestions for possibly improving your space, but also if they ever had to come in, they would have some sense of who you are. And then, of course, to involve them in your active shooter or your workplace violence discussions in the threat assessment team. So if you have an activation or you have an exercise, engage them. And they're usually very willing and able to play. Number 4, hugely important, is including emergency response plans for active shooter. I still, to this day, have companies call me and say, you know, our HR department doesn't want to include that in our emergency procedures because they're afraid it will scare people. Wow, we have to get over that. So what we're looking at, of course, when we talk about company plans is we're looking about a combination of things. We're looking about the run, hide, fight, or some combination. And notice I say some combination. Sometimes when people hear run, hide, fight, they think that that's actually mathematical. You do A, and then you do B, and then you do C. Well, no, not necessarily. You do whatever you need to do at the time. So people need to be educated about what all 3 of those options are. And of course, I'm talking to a group of security professionals, and you know all of these, but I'm just going to quickly talk about what those 3 options are. And of course, one of the most popular videos on YouTube still remains the run, hide, fight video from Houston. So run, of course, evacuate. If you have the opportunity to have an escape route, plan it in advance. Leaving behind your personal belongings, keeping your hands visible when you exit, and of course dialing 911 when it's safe to do so. The The second option is going to be shelter in place or hide. So hiding in an area outside of that active shooter's view, getting underneath a desk, pulling your chair in behind you. If you're in a room, ideally without a window, block the door, block the entry to the area, silence your phone, and if you have a pager, believe it or not, people still have pagers, silence that, and of course dialing 911 when you're able to do so. And of course, the last option is taking action, which is the fight option, and using that, of course, only as a last resort when you are imminently threatened by the individual and your only opportunity to survive is to incapacitate the shooter. And that means incapacitating them, so not holding back, acting with incredible aggression, and then dialing 911 when it's safe to do so. The other thing I would want to see in your emergency procedures would be two other critical points. Point number one is, what do you do when law enforcement arrives? Employees need to know that. They need to know exactly what's going to happen, how they're going to approach the scene, and also what should be expected of them when they're exiting the building. Remaining calm, following instructions, making sure that you don't have anything in your hands. When you come out of the building, having your hands up, your fingers spread, your hands both visible. Not doing quick movements. They don't know who you are, and they don't know what your intentions are. So to avoid pointing or screaming or yelling, and not, of course, approaching officers who are there for other purposes, and that is not for talking with staff at that moment. The other thing you want to do is you want to also tell them how to call 911 and the information that likely would be used. So that's our critical point number two when we look at training. So location and the number of active shooters, if they have any sense of that. The physical description, if they have some sense of what the person looks like, how tall they are, what they're wearing, and so on. The number and type of weapons, if they have any idea, and then any kind of victim count that might be known when they report this issue as well. These are critically important pieces of information for all employees. And I will just say to you, we encourage our clients to not only promote this active shooter training and awareness in their business, but frankly to encourage people to have family meetings at home. So utilizing some of the materials that your company might give out, having everybody sit around the dinner table and watch the Run, Hide, Fight video on YouTube, and having a discussion. If you're at a movie house, if you're at a restaurant, what do you do? So that everybody, I know it sounds awful to have to teach your whole family that, but we all know that we need to do that, and we want to make sure that everybody is as safe as they possibly can. So then, number 5, training people. This is critically important, and I find this is a huge area where people fall down on. When we talk about training your employees, we actually divide employee training in 3 categories: employees, managers, and company responders. So on that note, we have a second poll, and Michael, would you like to run this one?
Absolutely. So our second question, employees at my company know what to do to report a threat or a suspected act of violence. Do you strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree? And we will give you just a moment or two. Let those answers pile up. Okay, Regina, we've got a strong response here. Overwhelmingly, 51% agree, with just 8% strongly disagreeing and 22% disagreeing. And again, the 20% strongly agreeing. Does that match up with what you're seeing in the field?
That's actually a really powerful response. And again, I think it must be because we have so many really excellent security professionals on this call. To have roughly 70% of our audience saying that they agree or strongly agree that their employees know how to report an act of violence or a potential threat. So kudos to you. That is not what I normally see. I would say normally I see it the reverse, where maybe 30% know what to do and 70% don't. So congratulations, you're doing well. So let's talk about employee training. And again, there's 3 types of training. I'm going to talk generally about your employees and what you're telling them. Ideally, you want to make sure they clearly understand everything that is important for them to know about your policy and your program. So that means reviewing the policy at a high level, talking about unacceptable behaviors and language, and be explicit. Talk about bullying, if that's in your policy. Talk about threats, and then all the obvious physical acts. Deeply talk about how incidents are managed and reported, because I will tell you that's the number one fear why people don't report. They don't know what's going to happen when they actually say something, and they're going to be fearful of retaliation. So how does it get reported? How does it get managed? How does it get followed up? They need to know that. So you can do a very nice training for them in about an hour that includes all of the policy and program issues and then how to deal with an active shooter. We also, when we do this type of training, also talk about how to deal with difficult people, because a lot of folks don't have the skill about how to manage somebody who is loud or aggressive, and there's things that you might be able to say or do if it feels appropriate to manage a difficult person. So give people some tools so that they have that ability. Now, you also want to do manager training, and that's a different set of skills. You certainly start with what we just talked about, which is the company violence program and all the emergency procedures. So they need to know that just as well. But they should also be learning a little bit more about human behavior and recognizing signs when they should be concerned when they look at an employee or a vendor or a contractor or a customer or somebody who comes into the window or whatever. So knowing when people look like they might be a problem or having an issue, is there something that we might be able to do to support or help them? And that's where EAP and understanding what EAP does is so important. Also understanding the psychology of job loss. So terminations, several of our murders in our client population of the 47 were because of terminations. Understanding the psychology of job loss is a big deal. If you stop and think about the American person, when you meet or greet somebody, the first thing you ask them is their name, and the second thing you ask them is, what do you do? We in this society place a high value on what somebody does for a living. So it's absolutely essential that you understand what job loss means, and that will help you in managing it. Also, talking about the gut reaction. We're a big fan of Gavin DeBecker. I've had the privilege of taking his training on a couple of occasions. And he talks about the gift of fear and about how innately humans understand when they're presented with something if they need to do something about it. And that really is called that gut reaction, the gift of fear. And what Gavin talks about in his books and his training is that people generally try and talk themselves out of it. They might feel like, oh my God, I shouldn't really walk down that street. And then the next thing that comes out of their mind is, well, you know, what could happen to me? Really, it's not that late at night. And next thing you know, something does occur. So following that gift of fear or that instinct reaction is very important. The other aspects of in manager training should be how people could be assisting somebody. If somebody is presenting with some real significant problems, what are some interventions that are available? What kind of assistance might be available for folks? Which could be EAP, it could be other things in your company. Some people are under tremendous stress, either because of family situations, deaths, illnesses, divorce, financial problems, and sometimes people need additional support. And then also, again, we're a huge fan of scenario-based training. We do, as Michael said when he introduced me, I do 100 large exercises a year for companies. We do tons of scenario-based training because role-playing is really helpful. It's one thing to talk about something. It's another thing to do it. So having managers go through that kind of training is absolutely essential. You also want to make sure that your company responders are well trained. And who are those? Well, generally, in our mind, it's about 3 folks. It's usually your floor wardens or your emergency response team. What do they do? Your security force, as well as facilities. And, of course, the overwhelming thing is that people must act responsibly, and they should only be doing things that are safe for them to do. So that's the first caveat when there's an active shooter situation, of course. Protect yourself. But for floor wardens or emergency response folks, if it is safe to get people moving to exits, do so. If not, then they should be sheltering in place, as anybody on this list should be doing. Security, is it possible they might be able to make a public announcement in the building? Could they recall elevators in order to give the perpetrator less venues to move about? And they have to, of course, be prepared to meet the police when they arrive. At facilities, they might be providing keys or floor plans or any kind of support, educating them about what's in place in that building and also what kind of systems are there. So they need to know about what to do from a perspective of those issues in workplace violence. So your company responders are a key part of your response program. Number 6, making sure you have an emergency notification system and you conduct exercises with all of your staff. Emergency notification systems are now really a critical tool. When I first started my business in 1982, of course, they didn't exist. And when they first came out, people thought, well, gee, these would be nice, but now they've become essential. So your emergency notification system is really a critical tool for us to be able to manage information for any kind of scenario. But in an active shooter, oh my gosh, you have the ability to tell people exactly what to do. So think about, first of all, how you organized your emergency notification system. Can you send company-wide, or do you want to send a company-wide message? Because maybe it's worldwide, and that would be too much. Do you just do it by departments? Can you do it by floors? How do you segment it so that you can immediately send out messaging that's appropriate? Do you have other stakeholders loaded into your emergency notification system? So media, for example, or key vendors or contractors, and maybe you need to have those folks added to your system as well. And then you've got to practice. If you have an emergency notification system and you've never deployed it, then people don't know what to do when they get it, or they think it's a hoax or something else. So you've got to practice, and we say at least once a year, but certainly twice is much better. So let's see what our last poll is. Michael, do you want to take this?
Yeah, very good. Let's just do this really quickly so people have a sense of where their peers are. Our company, ENS, has preloaded templates on what to do in the case of an active shooter. So let's give just a few quick moments here. You guys are great. Okay, so the response is it's kind of spread apart. Almost 30% disagree, 29% agree. Full 35% don't have an ENS, and 6% don't know.
So that's actually something to really look at. So if you don't know, it's a good thing to find out. If it's a disagree, you need to really think about how you could add those. And if you don't have an emergency notification system, you might want to think about at least looking at that concept because it's such an effective tool, even for small organizations. So I encourage you to look at that. So thank you for that. So a couple of things also about emergency notification systems. Is you need pre-written templates. If you're evacuating, what people should do. If they're sheltering in place, what they should do. What people should do after the situation is resolved, as far as meeting places, or what's their response as far as business continuity. And you also could do a polling question, because many ENSs have the polling ability. You know, press 1 if you're safe and outside the building. Press 2 if you're hiding inside the building. Press 3 if you're injured inside the building, and so on. So the emergency notification system has a lot of things that you can use. The last one on my list is a critically important one, and that's conducting active shooter exercises with your incident crisis management team that focuses on aftermath. So notice what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about an active shooter situation in real time. I'm talking about aftermath. So this is where we might have a difference of opinion a little bit, but from the vast majority of businesses, this is my belief, that a full-scale active shooter exercise is not an appropriate exercise. I think it's very difficult to conduct in an office environment and it's fraught with peril. But if you're trying to teach evacuation, if you're trying to teach shelter in place, you can do that in many different scenarios, but you don't necessarily have to have a guy and a gun and a police squad on site. So the two key skills are evacuation and shelter in place. Now, I do believe that it is very appropriate for 2 primary areas to do active shooter full-scale exercises. And by full-scale, I mean gun, police, etc. One of them is emergency departments and hospitals, because that's a place where that has increasingly been a problem. And second is in education, in classrooms. So what I'm really focusing on in my number 7 is about the aftermath. Because everybody talks about active shooters as if once it's over, and that is true. But I'm here to tell you that from a business continuity, crisis management, and crisis communications problem, that company's issues have just now begun. The awful issues of the emergency response and the death and mayhem has ended, but this is going to go on for a very long time. And again, my first example of this in 1993, that company went out of business, even though it was the 3rd largest law firm in the state of California. They could not emotionally recover from this event. So you've got to work with your crisis management team And when we do exercises, we probably, of my 100 I do a year, I probably do at least 20 that are active shooter type aftermath exercises. We always start the exercise clock, if you will, which is after the incident is over. The perpetrator is either captured or dead, because if you start the clock from the moment the perpetrator enters the building, you're doing an emergency response exercise. It's not about business continuity, crisis management, or crisis communications. So we always start it on the aftermath. And what we do is focus on that. And the key areas we focus on are your employees and how are they going to emotionally recover, go to work, do business continuity, any of those things. Human resources, all the communications issues, both traditional and social, business continuity, and brand and reputation management. And I will tell you, that's what we executives are the most anxious about. Can your company recover emotionally in order to be able to continue? We always do 2 exercises, and every time permits, we at least try and have a 4-hour block of time, a little bit for a briefing, and then we do 2 parts to this exercise. The first part could be 90 minutes, and with a whole series of injects related to this scenario, but it's after the person has been apprehended or killed, and the scenario is all about communication and the media. And how do you manage that? How do you communicate to your employees? What do you say to the media? And it's all about that most awful moment of that first moment. What do we do? And then our second exercise, which we immediately follow, we normally fast forward maybe 4 or 5 hours, and we deal with things like how to account for staff. How do you continue the business? What do you do when you can't get in your building for days because it's a crime scene? And then how do you communicate to your key stakeholders? Those are all critical things that your company needs to really look at. The last thing I want to mention about this is that we preface any exercise we ever do or any training we ever do with talking about violence. And we say very clearly that the narrative involves violence and that we don't know who in that audience, either in that exercise or that training, has been personally involved with violence in their life. There's a lot of that in the United States, and a lot of people have experienced it. So I always tell people in a training or an exercise, I don't know what your story is, but if you feel really upset, you need to stop, walk out of the room, take a deep breath, collect yourself. I also remind people of what their EAP options are because they could be emotionally really upset. And our job is not to torture them. And lastly, the deliverables that you're looking for when you do this kind of exercise is obviously clear written incident action plans. I'm looking for really good written communications, and I'm looking for the business recovery strategies and continuity strategies that they're going to have and need in order to survive this issue. And then lastly, you want a really good after-action report because you're going to come away from this exercise with a zillion things that you need to work on. I'll just tell you that right now. So from a next steps perspective, before we talk about questions, I really ask all of you, I guess from certainly the number of people who signed up for this webinar, we all understand this, but I ask you again to take it seriously. And I really suggest that you really engage your senior management about this, because they think about this whether you've ever talked to them about it or not. You can bet they're thinking about it. You need a clear work plan, clear assignments, and a timeline, and you need to get going because we have a lot to do. So on that note, let's hear what our questions are.
Very good, Regina. Okay, this is the lightning round. Are you ready?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. Is the "it's never happened here" rationale a big reason for not pursuing training?
That is such a great question, and I guess I would say to you this. So if you stop and think about the world as we live in it today, if I would have said to my clients before 9/11, we're going to have an exercise in the World Trade Center, and 2 planes are going to hit the building at the same time, they would have thought I was nuts. What I would say to you now is if you look across the broad enterprise of the United States and the world, there are things happening every single day in increasing numbers of, that have never happened before. Just because it has not happened at your organization doesn't mean it can't. And all I would say to you is talk to your HR department and look at the kind of threats you've already gotten and your security department, and you believe me, you can talk somebody into this important behavior pretty darn quickly.
Okay. Regina, you did address this in the presentation. My HR department says that teaching employees about what to do during an active shooter event or attack will only scare them. Do you have any specific guidelines for people to get past that hurdle?
That's really a great question. And what, again, I would say is that they should really do a couple of things. I would encourage them to reach out to their HR department, probably bring in a security person at the same time, and bringing in legal, and having a really good conversation about the importance of what does it mean to train people to know what to do in the case of an emergency. That would be, it's almost as silly as saying, okay, we're in tornado country, but we're not going to teach them what to do because it will just scare them that we're going to have a tornado. That's crazy. So you need to have good skills about what to do. And so I would encourage you to bring together the right people, and you need to just hammer this. And really, and the other thing I would say to you that one of your best solutions for this is talk to somebody in senior management and get them to be your sponsor and to buy this and believe in it, because that will help you if HR says, no, 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 we can't do this.
Very good. Our next question. I would like to know what your thoughts are on having key employees participate in something similar to ALICE training. Also, is post-event litigation becoming a more prevalent thing with regards to employer liability?
So again, for the training, as I talked about earlier, my preference in training, I think there's many types of training that can be done well and effectively. I am not a huge fan of engaging full-scale exercises for most employee populations, with the exception of healthcare and schools. The issue of litigation, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, but I tell you that in the last three cases of workplace violence that we had, where people have died, there have been lawsuits and litigation that have followed all three of them. That wasn't at the beginning, back in 1993, but that has progressed, and I would imagine, that would be a great case study, but I would imagine that litigation almost always follows, because, and the other thing I would just say is that if you look at OSHA, there's a general duty clause. The general duty clause in OSHA of all 50 states says you must provide a safe work environment. And if you have threats or no threats and you don't manage those appropriately, then you could argue, probably in a court of law, although I'm not an attorney, that you did not protect your employees, and therefore you violated the general duty clause.
Very good. Next question. How do you advise dealing with the chaos of social media, tech media, while managing a crisis in real time?
That's a really great question. So social media is a huge part of this whole story. And I would say to you, looking at your crisis communications program and your crisis communications team and your crisis management team, they need to have clear training and practice on how to manage this, because it will be drinking out of a fire hose. Now what will happen is that when a case happens at your location, it will go out on Twitter immediately, and there'll be a ton of tweets before you have done a thing or said a thing. And that's why, again, this training, this practicing, this exercising with crisis communications is so important. A pre-written template that you put on Twitter immediately, it says, situation in our office, we're investigating, so that at least people know that you are paying attention. So you need to have some training with your crisis communications team, and they need to be monitoring, at minimum, Twitter, because that will be real time. And I will tell you, the news organizations in your city, they follow Twitter too, and they will be following it to your business to follow this breaking news story.
Very good. Can you speak to exercise design and some of the big hits when it comes to performance indicators for any exercise, realizing that exercise design is a training need in and of itself?
So what we do when we design an exercise about workplace violence in particular, what I always start with our clients is we ask what I call the silly little question: why are we doing this? Now that sounds completely easy and simple, but it's not. If you deeply understand why you're doing an exercise, then that will help design the exercise literally in front of your eyes. It tells you what your goal is. It tells you what your objectives are. And if you're concerned about, so if I hear when I ask that question to a variety of people at one of our clients, and they say to me, I'm really concerned that our HR department doesn't know how to respond. I'm concerned that our EAP may not be effective. I'm concerned that our crisis communications team may not be able to manage the media. That's part of my exercise design right there, because we're going to have a ton of media. We're going to have lots of tweets. We're going to have lots of HR-related concerns. We're going to have EAP possibly not delivering on as many counselors as they want. We're going to push all of those issues because it's a concern for them. But if you start your design by interviewing the key players, which could be, senior management and key individuals in security and facilities and HR, and ask them the question, why should we be doing this kind of exercise? What do you want to get out of it? It will design your exercise, all the deliverables, the goals and objectives for you in real time in those conversations.
Very good. Regina, we're just going to have to ask you back sometime because I've got a ton of questions left, but we have run out of clock today. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is all the time we have for today's presentation. I would like to thank you for attending today's Security Management webinar. You will get a link to the archived event tomorrow. In the resources panel of that archived event will be a downloadable version of the slides. A lot of people were asking about that as well. Please feel free to share this with any of your colleagues. They get to see it for free just like you did. So I'd like to thank our sponsor, particularly Everbridge, for making this event possible, and to Regina Phelps for generously sharing her expertise. For ASIS and Security Management Magazine, thank you for coming. Have a great day.